Well, welcome to Temple University Japan campus. I'm Robert Dujarric from ICAS. Just a few notes. If you're new to this, if this is your first time here, send us an email or give me or one of my colleagues a business card, and we'll make sure to add you to the email distribution list. I'd like to thank Evelyn and Yan for organizing all of this. And recognize Kai, who's the founder of our institute. Where is Kai? No, Kai is here. Okay, Kai was here, but he's back. So, thanks again. I'm very happy to have Kevin here. He's a well-known Japan expert. He's, I think, had almost every job related to Japan in the State Department. He's got numerous tours here. And I couldn't think of anyone better than him to talk about the topic at hand today. So he will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have our Q&A, moderated Q&A session. So you obviously came to hear Kevin, not me. So Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I was just telling him that I did about, in the State Department, I did about 20 years in Japan, but this is my first opportunity to actually come to Temple University. So I'm very happy to finally have the opportunity to do that. Can you hear me okay? This is my microphone. The topic is, kind of U.S. expectations of Japan in the national security arena, which is what I spent most of my career on in the State Department. But to give a little context of how the U.S. looks at Japan now in terms of the security alliance, I think you'd have to back up a little bit to get an idea of what I'd like to do is kind of where we've come from and how things have evolved over the years. I remember maybe one good starting point is the framework of the U.S.-Japan alliance is spelled out in Article 5 and Article 6 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and also the Status of Forces Agreement under that. But I used to always tell Japanese audiences when I was speaking here, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the U.S.-Japan alliance means. Most Japanese, even so-called experts on the security relationship back in the old days, used to always assume that the security treaty means the U.S. will defend Japan. And I always tell people, that's a fundamental misunderstanding. The security treaty means the U.S. and Japan will defend Japan. It doesn't mean the U.S. will defend Japan. If you read the language in Article 5 of the Security Treaty, it's Article 5 and Article 6. Article 5 says that in the case of an armed attack on Japan, then the U.S. will honor its treaty obligations. But Article 6 has two clauses. One is that, and it says the U.S. will contribute to the defense of Japan and contribute to the maintenance of peace and security in the East Asia region. So it doesn't mean that Japan has no role. It means the Jieitai, the self-defense forces in the U.S. will defend Japan together. That's a pretty simple explanation, but it's a very fundamental change that has taken place over the years in Japanese defense thinking. And fortunately, it's gotten to the point now with the security policy changes that were made in December of 2022 were very fundamental, and I think a lot of it is, I'll talk about this later, but I think a lot of it was part of an evolving trend over the years, whereas the threats in the region, primarily initially from North Korea, but also from China, there's just more of a recognition of that and more of a willingness of Japan to build its own capabilities, which is very much welcome in the United States. But to go back a few years to when I was when I was in the embassy, wasn't the first time I was in the embassy, but when the U.S. Embassy here, when the Gulf War broke out in 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, there was no expectation in the U.S. government that Japan would send troops to Iraq, to Kuwait to help in kicking the Iraqis out, even though Japan was very dependent on Middle Eastern oil, very concerned that the Iraqis would control the oil supply, which was the reason they attacked Kuwait. But at that time, the only thing the U.S. really expected from Japan was, and the only thing Japan was really able to offer was a monetary contribution. It was a very significant amount of money, and they were able to do minesweeping, but only after the combat had finished, only after there was no more combat. And it was a very effective contribution. Japan's mine-sweeping capability is one of the best in the world. And it goes back to the Cold War days where the U.S. roles and missions as divided between the U.S. and Japan. We used to call it Japan was the shield and the U.S. was the spear. Japan had a purely defensive role because of Article 9 of the Constitution, which I think you all know. And the one example of that was in the old days, in the Cold War days, which I'm showing my age. I grew up in the State Department when our majority of our focus when we went to work every day, particularly in the political military section, was, are we going to go to a nuclear war with the Soviets, and how do we prevent that? And Japan played a very important role in terms of blockading the straits coming out of Vladivostok between Hokkaido and Honshu or to the south. Japan's primary role was very defensive, no offensive capability. That was the role of the U.S. So we used to say, oh, Japan's the shield and we're the spear. That was kind of the fundamental structure of the alliance for a long time. But with the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, things started changing a bit. The Japanese made very significant financial contributions to the effort. And I was in charge. I was the deputy in the political military section in the embassy at the time. And I was in charge of what Japan called the Assistance in Kind Fund. They set up $1 billion that the U.S. could spend as it wished to buy things in Japan or elsewhere to send to U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia as they prepared for the fight with the Iraqis. But he got into all these tortured, I used to call them theological debates about what's allowable under Article 9 of the Constitution. One good example, CENTCOM, Central Command, asked the Japanese if they could spend $100 million to expand the tarmacs in Saudi Arabia. And these were military bases, but it was just the tarmac, where you park your airplanes. The finance minister said, oh, you can't use the money for that because that's military use. If it was a dual-use airport, it would be okay, but it's a military airport, so you can't use Japanese money under this program because that violates Article 9 of the Constitution. So me and my friend my colleague from the foreign ministry were really kind of angry about this. We're getting ready to go to war and this thing, and I said to the finance ministry, what's the difference between this and building a building? You build a building, it's just concrete, it's all you're paying for. We're not gonna throw the concrete at the Iraqis, it's not a weapon. So we thought about it and we went back to the finance minister the next day and said, here's the solution to this. We'll call this horizontal building construction. And the finance minister says, yeah, that works. And that's what we did. So that was the kind of thing you had, that was kind of the environment at the time. And this is a true story. And it wasn't hidden. It was reported to the finance ministry that this what it really was, and they knew. But fortunately, those things have changed. There was an evolution. Shortly after that, Japan passed the Peacekeeping Operations Law, which allowed Japan to participate in peacekeeping operations, but not in peacemaking operations. So in 1997, there was a fundamental change in thinking in the U.S.-Japan Defense Guidelines and Japanese law. They call it SISJ, situations in areas surrounding Japan, where if there was a security event taking place near Japan that could affect Japan's national security, Japan could support the U.S., but it was very much limited to logistic support, what we call rear area support. Even in those days, this was in the late 1990s, there was no expectation that Japan would participate in the fight. And one example of, well, I'll just go back up. After that happened, that was 1997. And the next big evolution in the security relationship was the Operation Enduring Freedom. After the 9/11 2001 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York, the U.S. got a coalition together. We called it Operation Enduring Freedom. And at that time, the Japanese were able to send ships to provide refueling operations for the U.S. forces in the Indian Ocean. But again, it was logistic support. It wasn't military combat support. But they were able to send ground self-defense forces and air self-defense force aircraft to Iraq, but again, not in a combat role. And you had this very tortured logic that if the Japanese troops there were fired upon, they could defend themselves. So Japan still had a policy with it. Japan could not exercise the right of collective self-defense. They could exercise individual self-defense. And the thinking in Japan always had been, if Japan is attacked directly, every country has a right to defend itself. The Supreme Court of Japan many times has ruled back in the old days that even though Article 9 says very clearly Japan can't have a military, every country has an intrinsic right of self-defense. So therefore you have a self-defense force. So if Japan's attacked, they could fight. But outside of Japan, still the thinking was very restricted. So there was a ground self-defense force officer who was the first unit commander for the self-defense forces that were in Iraq, and after the 2001 attack, Operation Enduring Freedom. But their role was limited to what they called nation building. They were embedded with the Brits, and their rules of engagement were, if a Japanese soldier is attacked, they can use their small arms to defend themselves. But if the Brits next to them are attacked, they couldn't react, because that would be collective self-defense. And in the Navy side, the example was always used, if you were outside of Japanese waters and there was a U.S. Navy ship and a maritime self-defense force ship near each other, if Russia or the Chinese attacked the Japanese ship, obviously the U.S. would respond and help defend and react to it. But if the U.S. ship was attacked, the Japanese couldn't do anything, because that would be collective self-defense. Obviously the U.S. was not happy with this, but we understood the background of it, and the U.S. has a certain amount of responsibility for how Article 9 of the Constitution is written, since we wrote it. And I always had a theory that one problem was a bad translation. The Article 9 of the Constitution says that Japan doesn't recognize the right of belligerency, but in Japanese it's kosenken. And the right belligerency and kosenken, if you look in the dictionary, that's the right translation, but it's not really the same meaning. Belligerency in the U.S. kind of has the connotation that you start a confrontation, you start a fight. But kosenken is gaiko no ko, it's either way. So the idea of the kosenken, as it's used in the Constitution, is that you really don't have the right to participate in military actions. So it's very restricted. But the thinking began to change, at least from the U.S. perspective. The Japanese, at least they were in Iraq, and they were making very meaningful contributions, particularly the ships that were providing fuel to Operation Enduring Freedom in the Indian Ocean was very useful. But Japan didn't get a lot of political credit in Washington for it, because in Washington, we're Americans, we kind of think, well, if you're not in the fight with us, you're really our friends, or you're really our allies. After the first Gulf War, there was a very famous politician, Michio Watanabe, who used to tell a joke about the first Gulf War. And he said you had an American, a Japanese, and a Brit walking in the neighborhood, and they see their friend's house on fire. So the Americans grab the bucket and start fighting the fire. The Brit sees the American, and then he grabs the bucket and starts fighting the fire. And the Japanese guy says, "You guys fight the fire, I'll pay for the water bill later." And that was really kind of the situation back in 1990 during the first Gulf War. And things were evolving in Japanese security thinking where there was more and more things that Japan could do, but still very restricted by, particularly on the ban on exercise and collective self-defense. But then the DPJ government came along with Hatoyama and then Khan, and Noda was actually fine. Noda was very realistic, a member of the DPJ. I became the Japan office director, and then a month later, Hatoyama became prime minister in the DPJ. And boy, it was a nightmare from Washington's perspective. The guy just didn't understand anything. He was like, he once said when he was prime minister that the U.S. and Japan and China should have an equidistant trilateral relationship. And Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State at the time. She called me up and said, what's he mean by this? The U.S., Japan, China, an equidistant trilateral relationship? And I had to explain to her he doesn't know what he means himself because he just doesn't understand these issues. You know, you can't ever imagine anyone's going to say the U.S.-China security relationship. We have a U.S.-Japan alliance. We're not going to have an alliance with China, and Japan's not going to have an alliance with China. But fortunately, after a lot of things happened, and Hatayama and then Khan came along, and then the earthquake and Fukushima Daiichi and that, and so that was the end of Khan. And actually, Noda was okay. I think if Noda had been the first of the DPJ prime ministers, the DPJ may still be around. But by the time Noda came, it was too late. And then Abe got reelected in December of 2012, and things really started to fundamentally change in the Japanese thinking on security policy. I think it was very realistic. And I think Abe's, from my perspective, the real legacy of Abe in terms of security policy in Japan, he was the first prime minister that was willing to explain to the Japanese public why you need to build Japanese defense capabilities and why the U.S.-Japan security alliance is important for Japan. Most of the prime ministers, even the LDP before the DPJ, they were perfectly happy to let the U.S. take all of the blame for training issues and things like that, and very unwilling to explain to the public, well, why do you need Marines in Okinawa? Why do you need Kadena Air Force Base? Because it was just easier politically to blame it on the U.S. And that really changed in December of 2012 when Abe came back. And the real reason that was driving it was the growing recognition among the Japanese public of the threat from China. Back in September of 2010, when I was the Japan office director, was when you had the famous at the time, when the Chinese fishing boat collided with a Japanese Coast Guard ship in I think it was September of 2010. And on the Senkaku Islands, as you probably know, the U.S. doesn't take a position on the sovereignty issue, but we recognize that they're under Japanese administrative control, so they're covered by Article 5 of the Security Treaty. But the press guidance the U.S. government always used about the Senkakus when we were asked are they covered by the treaty, we would just read Article 5 of the treaty that says an armed attack on areas under the administrative control of Japan is covered by the treaty. And the follow-on question would be, well, do you recognize the Senkakus are under Japanese administration? And we would say yes. We changed that at the time, and there was, right after that collision was the UN General Assembly in New York. So Secretary Clinton was there, and Maher from the DPJ was the foreign minister at the time. And we wanted to avoid any misunderstanding on the part of the Chinese about the U.S. commitment to protecting Japan if the Chinese attacked the Senkaku Islands. So we didn't change our policy, we just changed our press guidance to say, if we were asked, are they covered, we would say, yes, they are covered by the treaty, and the reason is, and then we would read Article 5 of the treaty. And diplomacy works that way. It's not a change in policy, it was just a change in how you explain the policy. But that was kind of where we were then. But Abe did a lot of things. He reversed 11 years of decline in the defense budget. Before 2013, for the past 11 years, every year the Japan defense budget was decreasing. And then for the first time in 11 years, it increased. But he wasn't able to get big increases in the defense budget. The average increase in the Japanese defense budget under the Abe administration was only 1.8% a year. So it wasn't a dramatic increase, but the policies had fundamental changes. And from my perspective, the most important change was in 2014 when the policy on collective self-defense was changed. And it made it clear that Japan can exercise the right of collective self-defense. There were a lot of restrictions that were put on it in the Diet debates following that, which the biggest one was the concept that Japan could exercise collective self-defense if Japan's existence, its sonritsu, is threatened. And that's a pretty high standard when you think about it. But Japan is able to interpret things as needed from time to time. And a lot of people thought this was a constitutional change. This wasn't a constitutional change. It wasn't a change in interpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution. It was a change in the interpretation and definition of minimum force necessary. The Japanese policy on collective self-defense was based upon the concept that under Article 9, Japan has a right of self-defense, but it has to exercise the minimum amount of force necessary to respond to an attack. And the interpretation that was changed by Abe was that collective self-defense, because of modern warfare and the need for networking and integration with your allies, requires the exercise of collective self-defense, that individual self-defense would not be sufficient in modern warfare. And so it was portrayed in the press and by a lot of American academics as well as a constitutional interpretation, but it wasn't really. It was just this concept of what's the minimum force required to defend Japan. But this really changed U.S. thinking about Japan. When we were doing operational planning, the real battle management operational planners in the U.S. military always assumed that outside of a direct attack on Japan, and I'll talk in a few minutes about the Taiwan scenarios or North Korea attacks on Korea, there never was an assumption that the U.S. could rely on Japan to do anything other than logistics support or rear area support. And so we didn't incorporate into our planning in any assumptions that we were going to have Japan aircraft or ships or ground personnel next to us fighting the North Koreans or fighting the Chinese if need be, unless Japan itself was directly attacked. And that thinking started to change, and it evolved, and Japan was able to start increasing its defense budget. So we started to have more discussions in the U.S. government about, and with the Japanese government, but okay, how are we really going to fight together if we need to? What can, and these are discussions that are still going on and haven't really been resolved yet in a lot of scenarios. And then the biggest change, as you know, was December of 2022. They put out the 3 new security documents, and they weren't revolutionary. They were more an evolution of how change was taking place in Japanese security policy over the years. But it was very much welcomed in the United States. From my perspective, one of the biggest issues one of the biggest changes was there's a new realism about the threats to Japan, and driven by China. Always there's the threat of North Korea, but China has surpassed that in terms of what people see as a real threat. A lot of people think that the Ukraine situation, Russia's attack on Ukraine, is what drove these changes. It didn't drive the changes. The changes were heading in this direction already, but it accelerated. I think a lot of Japanese leaders in the defense establishment and in the Diet, when Russia attacked Ukraine, they realized this is real. This isn't an abstract debate anymore. The Chinese could do the same thing, or the North Koreans could do the same thing, because now they have the capabilities, the missile capabilities from North Korea, and also the growing capability of the Chinese to project power, and their air power, and their missile power, and their naval power growing. The Chinese threat became real. There'd been a lot of discussion about it, but when they saw Russia's, all of a sudden, it was like, oh, who could have imagined in today's age you're going to have this big land war in Europe? So they woke up, and it accelerated the process. And there's several other really important parts of the security policy changes was that, and also the emphasis on sustainability and getting their operational rates up, getting their ammunition stockpiles up. We used to estimate when I was in the embassy, if Japan really went to war, if they were attacking war, they'd probably run out of ammunition in about 3 days. And the reason for that is the finance ministry would never fund building ammunition stockpiles, because their assumption, they used to say, well, why would we put a lot of money into ammunition that we're just going to put in warehouses? We're never going to have to use it. It's just a waste of money. But that thinking has changed. Even within the finance ministry, that thinking has fundamentally changed, fortunately. And there's more emphasis on, rebuilding their facilities. And I think their biggest hurdle that Japan's facing right now is really demographics. It's, you've got a declining population, and we face the issue all over the world with supply chain issues, but it's really hard to recruit people now. The self-defense forces have had recruitment issues for a long time. It's getting more and more difficult because it's just a smaller people to draw from. We're facing that issue to a certain extent in the U.S. as well. But one of the other big changes in new policy was the changes in defense export policy, and the Abe administration made some changes to the defense export policy, but they really haven't gone as far as they need to go. I'll talk about this a little later, but they've got the concept that that defense exports of defense equipment are important in building alliances and coalitions, and they got that part, but they haven't got to their threshold they haven't crossed is the ability to export lethal weapon systems. And I tell my Japanese defense ministry friends, you know, there's not a big market for weapons that don't kill people. It's a very limited market. And it's a real issue now with the Japanese inability to provide some things that Japan has that would be very useful to the Ukraine. But they're debating now whether they're going to loosen the export policy a little more, but they're not there yet. But the biggest change, from my perspective, in the new defense policy is the introduction of counterstrike. And people like me that have worked on the U.S.-Japan defense relationship for years, you know, 10 or 11 years ago, could not have imagined that we would now be coordinating with the Japanese of how to use Tomahawk missiles as counterstrike. And it's a fundamental change in thinking. And it's a welcome change from the U.S. perspective, because debate in Japan initially was that counterstrike was part of missile defense. And I used to tell people in Japan, I'd say this publicly on some TV programs sometimes, but, you know, you've got to understand missile defense is very important. You know, being able to intercept incoming missiles is key, but it doesn't solve the problem. You're going to run out of defensive missiles long before the enemy runs out of offensive missiles because of the expense. And, you know, for example, the SM-2 block, or the SM-3 Block 2A anti-missile missile, this thing is like, you know, $50 million missile. It's really expensive, and you just don't have enough of them. So the other side of the coin of missile defense is counterstrike. Missile defense gives you the time to use counterstrike, but if you only have the missile defense, it's not going to last very long, but it buys you the time to do counterstrike. A very simple example I used to use was, you know, if somebody's shooting arrows at you, you can shoot with missile defense. You can shoot down some of the arrows, but at some point you got to go and take out the guy that's shooting the arrows at you. You have to hit the archer, not just the arrows. It's a very simple concept, but that's really what counterstrike is really all about. But the debate initially about counterstrike publicly in the Japanese government was, well, counterstrike is really limited to missile defense, so it would be limited just to hitting missile launch sites, and that's very hard. And I used to explain to people, no, you've got to look at the command structure, the refueling, the production facilities. You can't think of counterstrike and missile defense of just hitting the missile launch sites, because mobile launchers are really hard to find and really hard to hit. So you've got to take out the whole structure. And that's, fortunately, when the LDP made its recommendations in the summer of 2022, that was expressed in the security changes that were made. It's not limited just hitting mobile launch sites. But counterstrike is very much welcomed by the U.S. Because the assumption now, because Japan can exercise the right of collective self-defense, is that we're going to be fighting together, and it just brings more capacity to the fight. We want Japan to have as much capability as it can because we're allies, and if we have to fight the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Russians, we want Japan to have the best and the most capability that they could possibly have. But prior to the change of policy on collective self-defense in 2014, when I was in government, when people would address the issue of should Japan have counterstrike, the views in Washington were very divided about this. And there were some people who thought, no, if Japan has counterstrike, they'll be less reliant on the U.S., so it will weaken the U.S.-Japan alliance. And I always argued against that. And I said, no, we have to assume we're going to fight together, so we should want Japan to have counterstrike because it helps the U.S. And it helps Japan, it helps the U.S., and it has tremendous deterrent effect. My concern was always that the North Koreans would, before Japan made the decision to introduce counterstrike, North Koreans, you can imagine a scenario where North Koreans would launch a missile and hit Hokkaido, not a nuclear missile, but just a conventional weapon, doesn't kill anybody, kills some cows or something. So the question is, would the U.S. respond by attacking North Korea? And that's a big question mark. You know, the U.S. would defend Japan, but would that be the first priority? So in the question in deterrence is always, what does the other side think? Not what do we think? So if Kim Jong-un's thinking he can drive a wedge between the U.S. and Japan by a strike like that on Hokkaido that doesn't hurt any Japanese citizens, would the U.S. launch an attack on North Korea? And if he assumes we would not, then because we know that if we attack North Korea, then they're going to attack Seoul, and Seoul is within range of thousands of conventional artillery pieces. Any military scenario on the Korean Peninsula, Seoul is going to have tremendous casualties. There's just no way to avoid it because of the geography and the closeness of North Korea. Kim Jong-un could be thinking that's a real way to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Japan, because the Japanese public would expect that the U.S. would react to that. So Japan having its own counterstrike capability takes that scenario off the table. And that was always my argument in the U.S. government, was we have to avoid that kind of situation where Kim Jong-un or Xi Jinping assumes that they can drive a wedge between the U.S. and Japan. So when Japan introduced counterstrike and made the decision on, or before they introduced counterstrike, when they made the decision on collective self-defense, after that, I heard no opposition in the U.S. government to Japan having counterstrike. It's now very much welcomed by the U.S. government because the assumption is we're going to be working very closely together. And the Japanese made it very clear that when they introduce counterstrike, it's not really an independent capability. They're going to have to rely on the U.S. for intelligence and reconnaissance, or ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, for targeting information, for battle damage assessment, for with cruise missiles, you have to, first somebody has to suppress the air defense systems in China or North Korea or wherever. So the Japanese are very clear in their discussions with the U.S. when they requested Tomahawk. They know they're going to have to coordinate, work very closely with the U.S. on this. So it's a very healthy environment. But the other thing in the new defense policy that's very important was the 5-year defense buildup program. Because it's a 55% increase in the Ministry of Defense budget over the last 5-year midterm defense program. Now it's called the Defense Buildup Program. That's a tremendous increase in the Japanese defense budget. When that's implemented, Japan becomes like the third, depending on how you calculate and what other countries do. But 5 years from now, when this plan is implemented and the budget is put in place over the 5-year period, Japan becomes either the third or fourth largest defense budget of any country in the world. And Japan has always had a very robust Navy, maritime self-defense forces, but they become a very formidable force and has a tremendously effective and important deterrent capability. And the other thing, in January of 2023 of this year, the 2+2, the Security Consultative Committee, is called the 2+2 because it's the defense minister, foreign minister on both sides, and manage the alliance relationship. Japan has decided to establish the permanent joint headquarters as a warfighting command. Japan's always, not always, for the last 15 or 16 years, has had a joint staff office, just like the Joint Chief of Staff in the U.S. military, but it's not really a warfighting command. So they've never had a counterpart to U.S. Indo-PACOM headquarters, so we can coordinate operational planning and coordinate on things like counterstrike. The introduction of counterstrike is driving a lot of the discussions going on between the two governments now about how is the PJHQ going to manage command and control and battle management? How are we going to coordinate that between Japan and the United States to be more effective? And the reason it's important is modern warfare, the key to modern warfare, we recognize we can't defeat or deter, and if necessary, defeat the Chinese on numbers. We have to be networked. That's one thing, like the F-35 fighter aircraft. People think it's a fighter. It is a fighter, but it's much more. It's the node of this vast sensor network and this vast networked integrated fire control system that gives you a force multiplier effect. So what U.S. Indo-PACOM is doing is introducing what they call the Joint Fires Network. So you tie things like the Aegis ship systems and the F-35s and the F-22s, the ground-based, the missiles and things, you tie it all together so it's all networked so that, for example, if the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Russians launch a missile, the F-35 can detect that missile and in real time a calculation can be made who takes the best shot, the other F-35, the Aegis ship, a land-based system. And that kind of force multiplier is essential for modern warfare. It's very complex and difficult to do, but that's what modern warfare is now. So the PGHQ, as they're going to stand it up in Japan at the latest by March of 2025, which is a little over a year from now, a very aggressive schedule. But the idea that becomes a warfighting counterpart for U.S. Indo-PACOM so we can coordinate these things together. And at the strike, counterstrike is really a big part of that because we have to do the coordinated battle management. Simple things like we had experience in the Middle East, I won't name the countries, where they had missile defense systems and some group launched some missiles and the U.S. hit the missiles when the other country, our partners, started shooting their anti-missile missiles at the debris. That's the kind of thing you need to avoid. That's why the joint command and control, the integrated network, joint fires network concept is very, very important and essential. But again, the introduction of Tomahawk is driving these kind of discussions that are taking place now as Japan sets up the permanent joint headquarters about how are you going to do this all together. Now that's kind of where we're on policy. And let me take a few minutes and talk about, okay, what's this mean in terms of U.S. expectations of Japan? And I'll give one example that kind of makes it a little more clearer, I think, is Taiwan scenarios. I participated, there's a think tank here called the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, and this July they organized the second they did it a year earlier, of a Taiwan Strait crisis simulation. I participated in this. I played the role of the U.S. President, and Onodeta, the Diet member, former defense minister, who's now the LDP Research Commission on National Security chairman, played the prime minister. And this was all open to the press. I was really impressed that they would do this type of a simulation, totally open to the press. And we also had a Taiwan cell there, which was the first time that they brought the Taiwanese into this type of a simulation. There wasn't any Japanese government official participation, but there were a lot of people who had just recently retired from the Japanese government that were very key. They put the scenarios together. So it was a very, very realistic scenario. So the kind of issues that came up that we had to deal with were some of the following. If you have a Taiwan crisis situation, in my view, it's almost impossible for Japan to not get involved. Well, the reason I say that, if you may recall, when President Biden was here summer before last, he was asked in a press conference, if China attacks Taiwan, will the U.S. be militarily involved? That was the way the question was worded. And he said, of course we will. You know, our policy towards Taiwan has always been vague. We walk this line in the U.S. I say we, I make clear, I don't speak for the U.S. government. I've been out of the U.S. government for 12 years. But I still kind of say we by habit. So I'm not speaking for the U.S. government. But it's hard to imagine a situation where Japan could avoid being involved in the Taiwan crisis scenario. And the reason I say that is, as President Biden said, well, then back up a bit. The U.S. walks this fine line. We want to make it clear to the Chinese that you really shouldn't attack Taiwan. But we don't want to encourage the Taiwanese to declare independence. We don't want to go to war with China if we can avoid it. So we walk this very fine line of trying to be clear, and that line has gotten more and more clear over the last few years. And President Biden, when he said, yeah, of course we'll be militarily involved, a lot of people were surprised and thought that was a fundamental change in U.S. policy towards Taiwan. It wasn't a change in policy at all. It was kind of what we did when I mentioned earlier in the Coast Guard collision with a Chinese fishing boat in 2010. We didn't change our policy, we just talked about it a little differently, because the Taiwan Relations Act makes it very clear that from the U.S. perspective, any resolution of the Taiwan situation with China has to be peaceful and has to be acceptable to both sides. So what President Biden was really saying is, if China militarily tries to reunify with Taiwan, the U.S. is going to have a problem with that. And we do, under the Taiwan Relations Act, we do have a legal obligation under U.S. law to support Taiwan in terms of military supply. So we sell a lot and provide Taiwan with a lot of weapon systems and training. But in a real situation, what would happen if China decides it's going to retake Taiwan? They're probably going to blockade Taiwan to try to prevent the U.S. from resupplying Taiwan. And the U.S. is not going to just sit back. But it's a different situation from the Ukraine. We can supply Ukraine through Poland because we have land routes, so we avoid the direct confrontation with the Russians. In the Taiwan scenario, the only way to resupply Taiwan as an island is through air transport or ship transport, and the Chinese are going to try to stop that. And when they try to stop that, there's going to be a conflict. The U.S. is not going to just say, okay, you blockaded it, we can't do anything about it. So you almost kind of automatically get drawn into a military confrontation between the U.S. and China. But what the Chinese also know, that any conflict over Taiwan, everything from the U.S. is going to flow through Japan. Under Article 5 of the Status of Forces Agreement, you know, we have our bases in Japan. We also have a right of access to any civilian port or airfield in Japan under Article 5 of the Status of Forces Agreement. So our expectation is we're going to be using a lot of facilities in Japan. But even if we were just using U.S. military bases in Japan, the Chinese know everything's flowing from Japan. So at some point, they're going to try to stop that. The other factor is, if you look at the geography of what Japan calls the Southwest Islands, the Nansei Shoto, it's mostly Okinawa, but it's also part of Kagoshima Prefecture. Tanegashima and those islands are part of Kagoshima. But the Southwest Islands, it's really close to Taiwan. You know, Yonaguni is only 110 kilometers from Taiwan. When I was a consul general in Okinawa, in 2007, we did the first U.S. Navy ship visit to a civilian port in Okinawa Prefecture. We routinely do U.S. Navy ship visits to ports all over Japan, and we have for decades. And it's pretty routine, but we'd never done it in Okinawa outside of the military port that the U.S. base has. So when I got to Okinawa, I told my staff, you look ahead. We didn't have any plan to militarize the Southwest Islands. I was accused of that many times by the opposition in Okinawa. But you just look at the map and you understand, if there is a conflict with China involving Taiwan, the Southwest Islands are going to play a very important role. So I asked the U.S. Navy to come do the ship visit, and we did, and we had some opposition. But you look at Yonaguni now, there's a Japanese Self-Defense Force radar station in Yonaguni. And it's 110 kilometers from Taiwan. Japan now has a self-defense force base in Ishigaki and Miyakojima. And that's all fairly recent that they've been able to do that. Just to give you one example of just an anecdotal, but a true example of how thinking has changed. After we did the visit to Yonaguni in 2009, we did another U.S. Navy ship visit to Ishigaki, and the mayor was what they call a kakushinha, a reformist, an anti-alliance guy. And the ports, civilian ports, in some places are controlled by the mayor, some places by the governors. He declared a state of emergency because of 2 minesweepers were coming from Sasebo. But the Maritime Self-Defense Force officer in Okinawa told me a couple of nights before we did the ship visit to Ishigaki, we knew we would have some opposition, which we did. And he said, I really hope the U.S. Navy can get your ship in Ishigaki, because then maybe we can get our ships in Ishigaki. I said, what? Are you serious? you can't put maritime self-defense force ships into, it's a Japanese port. And they said, no, we can't do it. It's too politically difficult. So you guys go first, and we did. Now they've got a base there. But that thinking has changed because, as I mentioned earlier, the Japanese government now understands that the alliance doesn't just mean the U.S. defends Japan. It means we defend Japan together. So I'm digressing a little bit here, but I was really happy to hear during the Taiwan simulation that we're doing, in the role of Prime Minister, it was just a simulation, but he was willing to say this in front of the press. Onodera himself, a year ago when we did this the first time, said, we really need to think of Taiwan and the Southwest Islands as the same battle space, which is very realistic, but a very politically sensitive thing for a Japanese politician to say, even though it's just a simulation. But some other issues that came up that would be real issues in the Taiwan scenario, I think one of the early issues would be what we call NEO, N-E-O, non-combatant evacuation operations. It's very difficult to get people out of Taiwan, Japanese and U.S. I mean, the U.S., technically the State Department's in charge of NEO operations, but all of the assets are military assets, because once a situation goes hot, civilian aircraft and ships will stop traveling to Taiwan or anywhere else where we're doing NEO operations. And NEO operations are important because from a logistics perspective, as the U.S. would flow logistics support and weapons support into Taiwan, those same aircraft and ships would become empty, and then you use those to bring people out, U.S. citizens and Japanese citizens out of Taiwan. So the question in the scenario is, okay, how much operational support are we going to get from Japan for doing this? And is Japan willing to send aircraft and ships of its own into Taiwan? And the expectation from the U.S. side is, yes, you're going to be there with us, right? And it's not real clear yet. There are discussions going on about this. But we also address the issue that we also need to coordinate this with the Taiwanese. Just like for years we've done NEO training exercises involving Korea, but until recently, because of the relations on and off between Japan and Korea, there's no clarity for example, would the South Koreans let Japanese ships come in, military ships come into South Korean ports? Or are the Japanese military ships and aircraft going to be able to come into Taiwanese ports? And it's very politically sensitive, but it was addressed in the simulation we did, and with the expectation on the U.S. side, which I think reflects U.S. government thinking as well. We expect the Japanese to be participating in this. And it's kind of the beginning of a scenario because NEO operations normally take place before the fighting starts, if possible, because once the fighting starts, it's pretty hard to do. And another issue was, if there's a realistic scenario people deal with a lot for a long time is Chinese pretending to be fishermen, but they're actually military and armed, land on the Senkaku Islands. And then what do you do? And I remember years ago when I was in Okinawa, a exercise with a think tank, and it was a Japanese government-related think tank. Their scenario was like this, and the expectation was, it's too provocative if the self-defense forces or the Japan Coast Guard or the Japanese police go to the Senkaku Islands to try to kick these so-called fishermen off. So why don't we call them Marines? And this was, 15, 20 years ago, and my reaction was, are you guys serious? And the counterpart from Japanese said, well, if the U.S. wouldn't go respond to this would be the end of the alliance. And I said, no. If Japan's not willing to defend its own territory, that's the end of the alliance. If you want, and that's a lesson of Ukraine that I think a lot of people see, as opposed to Afghanistan. If you're not willing to fight to defend your own country, it's kind of hard to rely on the U.S. or anybody else to fight the fight for you. You got to be willing to defend yourself if you want expectation. And that's the kind of thinking in Japan that has fundamentally changed. And it's very welcome in Washington and among people who have followed the security relationship for many years. But still, it's something that has to be worked out in the details. But in the scenario, what became an issue was, how long did it take the Japanese government to formally recognize that there was an armed attack on Japan? And that took a few weeks in the scenario, and the U.S. was very frustrated. I actually planted a question in the scenario, in the simulation exercise. I planted a question in the Japanese press was, how many Japanese people have to be killed before it's considered an armed attack? Because the scenario was that Japan did eventually send the Coast Guard and Japanese police, and some of them were killed, but they still didn't declare it's an armed attack. I think in reality, they would be much quicker. But those things have to be worked out between the U.S. and Japan ahead of time. And then the next stage in the scenario, and this is where I think the question of U.S. expectations being very high was illustrated, was when can Japan exercise the right of collective self-defense in a Taiwan scenario? In the simulation, and I think this is also something that U.S. expectations are, that this will be worked out as Japan sets up the permanent joint headquarters and we were able to do operational planning on a Taiwan scenario. These are realistic expectations, I think, from the U.S. side, but this was me in the scenario. My first question was, okay, obviously we're going to expect the U.S. expectation is that we will be able to use Japanese facilities, civilian and military, to support U.S. actions in Taiwan. Not just U.S. military bases, but civilian facilities, and not just ports and airports, but things like hospitals and logistics support and fuel support. And that's easier to do because that's just kind of logistics support. But the other things were things like, as I mentioned earlier, will Japan support, and not just support logistically, but participate in NEO operations, but also the Taiwan resupply operations? Because as I mentioned, they're really, logistically, they're kind of the same thing. Can we expect to have Japanese ships and aircraft with us in a resupply effort of Taiwan? And logistics cooperation throughout the whole theater. And then where it gets much more sensitive is in terms of Japan's decision on exercising collective self-defense. Can we expect Japanese coordination and networking and participation in air operations throughout the theater? For example, I would anticipate as a situation in Taiwan develops, the U.S. at some point is going to try to get air superiority over Taiwan. It's hard to imagine early on China would actually do a land invasion of Taiwan. It's very costly. It's very difficult to do. So the expectation is that we'll probably use missile attacks, but at some point you go beyond missile points to doing aircraft attacks. So if the U.S. can get air superiority over Taiwan, it really eases that impact on Taiwan. So the fundamental question really in terms of Japanese participation in air operations is, are your F-35s going to be networked with our F-35s in terms of the defense of Taiwan? If there's an attack on Taiwan, and the U.S. expectation is, yeah, you guys need to be with us here because you can exercise right of collective self-defense. And I think former Prime Minister Abe understood this very clearly when he said, shortly before he was unfortunately assassinated, he said very clearly, a Taiwan crisis is a Japan crisis, because he understood it's really hard to separate the battle space between the Southwest Islands and Taiwan. And he understood very clearly the Chinese are unlikely to sit back and watch the U.S. flow support through Japan without responding to that. But as related to that is the question of, okay, how about our surface warfare and our submarine operations? Is Japan going to be fighting with us? Are we going to coordinate? Can we expect Japanese submarines to sit north of Taiwan to block the Chinese Navy's attempts to come into the Southwest Islands and coordinate that with the U.S. operationally? There's surface warfare, and ideally, as U.S. Indo-PACOM sets up what they're calling a joint fires network, this is all coordinated in our command and control and our battle management, so we get that force multiplier effect that I was mentioning earlier. And then related to that is the whole operational concept of coordinating our anti-access and denial operations on the Southwest Islands. You probably saw press reports back earlier in the spring or winter of this year, after one of the 2+2 meetings, where it was announced that the U.S. Marines in Okinawa are setting up it's not an additional regiment, this reorganizing to have a littoral combat regiment to operate in the Southwest Islands, not just with, but a big part of their operational capability would be surface-to-ship, mobile surface-to-ship missiles, so you can deny the Chinese ships access in the Southwest Islands. But we want to be doing that together with the Japanese, not a Japanese force and a U.S. force, but network forces. And then the bigger issue that's really being worked on very intensively right now is the expectation that we're going to coordinate on use of counterstrike. As you know, Japan's getting initially 400 Tomahawk missiles. These are cruise missiles, but you know, some Japanese politicians initially, who weren't really military experts, who support counterstrike, had this concept: well, Japan will get Tomahawk or other counterstrike missiles without thinking about the complexity of how you use strike. It's very difficult. You've got to have the intelligence and the reconnaissance. You've got to be able to suppress the air defenses. You've got to be able to do battle management assessment and the command and control and the sensors. This is stuff that the U.S. has worked on for decades, and it's very expensive. It's very difficult. The Japanese leadership understands the difficulty, so they're coordinating this with the U.S. very intensively right now. Time? Okay. And so those are being worked out. So as we go forward, in terms of these types of issues, and just to sum up kind of on U.S. expectations, first, our expectation is Japan is going to very quickly and efficiently as possibly implement the defense buildup program, and I'm very confident they're going to do that. They're committed to it. The finance ministry is supportive, and I think that's going to go forward very quickly. It is going forward very quickly. The other idea is that building up their resiliency and their sustainability. They're working very hard. There's a lot of money in the budget for building up their ammunition stocks. Their issue is production capacity. And another expectation is we really are going to get networked and become joint and networked in such a way that Japan maintains its own command sovereignty. No one in the U.S. expects we're going to have a combined command where the U.S. commander is going to be making decisions for the Japanese. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about becoming part of a joint fires network so we can coordinate and network when we want to. And Japan would clearly maintain its own sovereign command authority and wouldn't just be following orders from the U.S. That's not the U.S. expectation. But in order to be able to do that, Japan needs to improve its information security, and it's working on that, making a lot of progress, not just on cybersecurity, but also information security. And also, they're introducing a security clearance system. You know, they don't really have much of a security clearance system now, and that's essential for information security because the weak link in any security system is people. And the U.S. has to be careful about not being too arrogant, criticizing other countries' information security, because we've had a lot of our own problems, like WikiLeaks, and I've had my reporting out in WikiLeaks when I was in Okinawa, and we've had these security problems, but it's the vulnerability of people. And just real quickly, the other expectation is that as the Japanese stand up current joint headquarters, that I'm hoping U.S. PACOM will have a forward presence here so they can work very closely together in their operational planning and their training and their coordinations on roles and missions. That's all essential. And this also needs to be done with the Koreans. We're very hopeful that the Yoon administration is being very cooperative with Japan. It's a unique opportunity now to kind of institutionalize Japan-South Korean cooperation, so whichever the next administration in Korea is can't just erase all the progress that's been done. And then finally, the last thing I worry about that Japan needs to make a little more progress is their policy that doesn't allow export of lethal weapon systems. There are a lot of things Japan could be contributing to the Ukraine that would be very useful. Like there was discussion in the press about 155 millimeter mortar, artillery shells. Japan has the old Hawk missile, air defense systems that they don't use, an old system. It's sitting in warehouses they're going to dispose of it. They're very good systems. It would be very effective against Russian slow cruise missiles, the drones that the Iranians are supplying, but they're just not quite there yet. in terms, and I'm hoping in the next couple of months they're going to change that policy so they could start making a more concrete contribution to the Ukraine. So I'll stop here. Sorry to just bounce around a little bit, but I'm happy to take any questions, comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin. This was a wonderful tour d'horizon, and I'm really happy we're able finally to have you at TUT.
Yeah,
So thanks
thank
again for taking the time. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. So this is a semi-democracy. In other words, ask questions. I may bundle a few together. So, okay, and if you can, state your name, registration number, and you don't have to, but
Use the DNA sample as well?
yeah.
Alice Gale with the Wall Street Journal, thanks very much for your presentation. I was actually at the simulation that you were part of. It was very interesting to me to see that moment when Moderator was like pressing you for targets that they could use the counterstrike. And I've always sort of had this assumption that it would be the Japanese side that would be slow moving on this, but it's interesting that you were saying, well, it's going to take us a few days to come back to you with things that you might want to hit. So that was, that dynamic was very interesting. My question is actually about, there's issues you raised about what would Japan contribute in a Taiwan crisis, such as, sending submarines to the north of Taiwan and doing other things. We seem to be a long way from having that conversation. I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of sort of, here in Japan, it's essentially taboo to talk about Japan helping Taiwan defend itself. There's no kind of like public opinion polling on that. Should Japan help defend Taiwan? There's no defense links between Japan and Taiwan. Do you, in your experience looking back on how Japan has changed, do you see a future where Japan is sort of committed to help defend Taiwan, the U.S.?
I hope we're there soon. They're not there yet. Thinking has changed a lot, though. I think when Abe made his statement about a Taiwan crisis as Japan crisis, that was a big change. And he got some pushback, but he didn't get as much pushback as you would expect just a few years ago. And I think it's because of the public is, even in Okinawa, is increasingly concerned about what the Chinese may try to do, and that has been reinforced by watching the Russians in the Ukraine. And I think we're from my personal perspective, we're at a very dangerous time in history right now. And I think the Japanese leadership understands that we don't want to send mixed signals to Xi Jinping or Putin or Kim Jong-un or the Iranians about our resolve. And as you say, it's very politically sensitive. In the scenario, I mean, just having the Taiwanese cell in this, even though it's a simulation, there was no active duty Japanese government participants there. But the people there talked to, these were a lot of recently very senior military or self-defense force and government people. The recognition, I think, is growing that it's going to be, first, nearly impossible to avoid being involved, but I think there are more voices understanding that Japan needs to be involved and needs to let it be known to the Chinese that they would be supporting the U.S. and the U.S. Taiwan for deterrence purposes. And it's interesting, the finance ministry thinking has really changed. I was pleasantly surprised in December of last year when the finance minister agreed to the overall amount in the 5-year build-up plan. The expectation would be much less. But a guy I know at the finance ministry, he explained, he said, there are different views on that within the finance ministry, but as a ministry, they came to the understanding that it's much less expensive and much less damage to the Japanese physical situation and economy to invest the money now to build the deterrence capabilities and deter a fight with China than it is to fight China. And I thought that was a very healthy way for the finance ministry to think now. And along those lines, I think it's, as you say, it's not something, I don't see any public discussion much other than the scenario, which was just a simulation. So it's easy for JFS to do this, but very difficult for the Japanese government to talk about it. But I've been very clear in public, we've got to find a way for the U.S. and Taiwan and Japan and Taiwan to coordinate on a lot of things. And in the scenario, we were discussing coordinating counterstrike with Taiwan as well. And we're not there. We're not close to being to that point yet, and the Japanese aren't either. But I think that's the future, is the Japanese understand that if China was allowed to take Taiwan, the Ryukyu Islands are next. And the Chinese, in 2010, when I was Japan Office Director at State Department, when the Coast Guard boat had the collision with the Japanese fishing boat, you saw a lot of demonstrations in China with supposedly student groups demonstrating, but they had these banners that said in Chinese, but it was like, retake the Ryukyu Islands. And that's a pretty, they couldn't say stuff like that in China without some type of, government approval for it. And you hear statement, when you look at what the Chinese call the Daiichi Rettosen, the 9-dash line, that's the Ryukyu Islands, that's Okinawa. That's where over half of U.S. military forces in Japan are. And that's the front lines. And, the Okinawans, it's a very complex situation in Okinawa. I was Consul General for 3 years, and I was criticized a lot for what we were doing, but I think there's a growing recognition in Okinawa as well, among the people of Okinawa, not so much the current governor, that Okinawans are the victims of geography. They're the front line with China, and there's no way to avoid that. And the Chinese have made it very clear that a fight they look at Taiwan and they see that that's very much connected to the Ryukyu Islands. So I think that kind of a recognition has grown to the point where the Japanese government has to think about, okay, how do we help prevent the Chinese from taking Taiwan? It's an unavoidable situation. But you're right, it's very politically sensitive, and you don't see public discussion of that by the government here.
Here, and then here, and then here. Okay, there you go, okay. Kind of try to be brief because there are lots of questions.
Sorry. So in one of my classes, we were looking at different demographic surveys, and in Japan, it looks like only 18%, like 18 to 29-year-olds are willing to fight.
Mm.
Do you see this as kind of a problem for the buildup? Because the planes and the ships need to be manned to actually do the thing.
Yeah, demographic trends are a real problem in Japan, and for years they've not been able to recruit to their authorized levels, and that's getting more difficult. And I've suggested for years, you really need to put some kind of incentives in place like the U.S. does, like the GI Bill in the U.S., and they don't have anything like here. I've heard that there's a discussion now, the maritime self-defense forces have the hardest problem, and a U.S. Navy friend of mine said, the biggest problem recruitment that the maritime self-defense has is when the people learn that you can't use Wi-Fi at sea. And it's like, well, there is a way to do it, but I've heard discussion, I'm not sure how far it's advanced, but in the government here, of introducing some financial incentives where they get, shipboard extra pay. The ASEV ships, the 2 new Aegis ships that they're introducing, but one thing they're doing to address that manning issue is they're going to move some ground self-defense forces to sea duty. But they're talking about getting incentives, financial incentives. But I think they've got to do a lot more of that kind of things to compete. But the government as a whole is having recruiting issues now, not just the self-defense forces. You can imagine if current demographic trends continue, their answer this isn't just something related to the Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Forces, but Japanese industry in general. They're going to have more immigration. It's not unusual in the U.S. We have a lot of non-U.S. citizens in the U.S. military. Historically, we had a lot of Filipinos. We have people from all over. It's the security clearance issues, but if you're an officer and things like that. But I think industry here in general. There's more. I first came here in 1976. there are a lot of foreigners in Japan now compared to those days. You know, in those days it was only downtown Tokyo. But it's a very difficult issue for the Japanese to officially recognize that we need more immigrants. But you're seeing more and more in reality, there are a lot more immigrants working here because a lot of the industries just couldn't function otherwise. So they need to make that official and recognize that it gives stability to people here and become more attractive. But there's opposition to it politically from some of the conservatives. But it's an issue. They think that some people think you can deal with it with unmanned systems or robotics. People need to understand somebody's got to fly those unmanned aircraft. They don't really save manpower. You still got to have a pilot. They're not autonomous, and sometimes they need more people because it's not the answer of having. You know, there's a role for unmanned systems, but its major benefit is not saving personnel. So that it's one thing. They're going to have more women in the self-defense forces and make it more attractive for women. They're just starting to have women fighter pilots. They've only had maybe 2 female ship captains, but that's the future. And I've always, you know, you still find some really conservative circles in the U.S. who don't like the fact of women in the military. So, well, women can't fight. And I'm like, if you think women can't fight, you've never been married. It's like women can fight, particularly for fighter pilots. I mean, there's no physical handicap to being female if you're flying a fighter pilot. And some of our best fighter pilots are female. And Japan is just recently having women as fighter pilots, but they're going to have to bring more women in and accelerate that process.
Here,
I'm Michelle Honda from Okinawa Peace Assistance Center, and I should note that we have nothing to do with the whole Okinawa. Our organization was initiated by Governor Nakaima 21 years ago.
What's the organization? The Okinawa?
OPA, Okinawa Peace Assistance Center.
Okay.
They used to work with the Okinawa Council.
Right.
And we, OPA and the NIA, we made a sort of like it's like it's taboo to talk about even talk about evacuation planning Okinawa openly. But we made what we call like evacuation recommendation last December, and last July we sent 2 sets of copies to every city and town and village in Okinawa as a evacuation recommendation. We tried to make it. We didn't use the word like Taiwan contingency or something. We make it as big as possible, but we thought what we should do, especially like Sakishima Shoto, when something happens, how we do it like 100,000 residents and 10,000 tourists. We made it, but even that was really questioned by 2 local newspapers in Okinawa. So we keep our voice low, but something we didn't put on that report was we think that if Taiwan contingent happens, yes, you are right that Taiwan is surrounded by sea. It's not like Poland, which are connected by land. But there are certain numbers of refugees which will shift to Okinawa. So under the table, we are talking about this possibility, what we should do about these refugees. Reaching to Okinawa or Tanegashima Wednesday. But sad thing is that in a place like Okinawa, in a current situation, we can't even talk about it. But my question is that when this happens, right? I believe that the Japanese self-defense force, the Kaijo JSDF, would help bringing Taiwan to Okinawa. But what's the U.S. role in the situation like this happens? Like non-civilians from Taiwan seeking refugee to like Okinawa or Japan.
I mean, NEO operations are very complex. We do a lot of planning in this when I was in the State Department of that, more focused on Korea coming to, but more also in terms of Taiwan. And as I was mentioning earlier, the logistics train for NEO operations and supply operations are very similar. But you could, I think you're right, you could expect anything that floats is going to be coming towards Okinawa out of Taiwan. And it's not just going to be U.S. and Japanese citizens. And one thing that people have to think about in NEO operations is you bring people out. You've got to have people ready to receive them and do things like health screening and try to weed out the Chinese spies and you have to have the people ready to try to. It's very difficult to do. You can't just say, okay, everybody come in and you're free to roam around. You've got to have all of the ministries of the Japanese government have to be involved in terms of medical supplies, transportation, housing, where you're going to put the people, food, water. It's very complex. And it's something that needs to be worked on very quickly because it's a very realistic situation. And when I was in Fukuoka for 3 years, many decades ago, when we would do exercises I was there 1998 to 2001, we couldn't even get the Customs and Immigration Service to participate in the NEO exercise that we were trying to do out of Korea. And it's got to be an all-of-government approach to deal with it. But the question of the civil defense for Okinawa in terms of building shelters and evacuations, it's very difficult to move that number of people if they're talking about evacuating. And my personal question is, where are you going to evacuate them to? The idea was bring people from Sakishima to Okinawa, to the main island, but Okinawa main island is going to be one of the biggest targets for the Chinese because that's where most of the U.S. military bases are and most of the Japanese bases are. So then people say, well, we'll move them to Kyushu, but Kyushu is a target too. So it's important, I think, somewhere like Yonaguni is, 1,700 people. That's not that hard to evacuate. But when you start talking about moving, 110,000 people, Japan, if they're going to do that, they've really got to increase their logistics capability. And you have to assume that commercial aircraft and commercial ships are not going to be going in if you got to that situation in a crisis. And at that point, you've got to have, Japan needs a lot more like KC-130Js to transport aircraft. They will carry like 95 people in seats, but as we saw evacuating Afghanistan in an emergency situation, you probably put about 150 people in a KC-130. But you do the numbers, if Japan now has like 10 KC-130Hs, the older 12, but only about 10 of them flying at any time, that's a lot of flights back and forth if you're trying to move 110,000 people. So the shelters and things like that is a very important part of the equation as well. Well, from missiles, I think the initial attacks would be missile attacks or bombing and things like that before the land. I think at some point, if the Chinese are successful, they would start doing landing on the islands. But initially, it's going to be missiles and air attacks, ship attacks, before you have people actually landing. So in that sense, having the shelters is a big, important part of the civil defense.
Evelyn?
Yes, I'm Evelyn. I'm in the Korean ICAS working with Robert and Kyle. And my question was regards to Taiwan war games because I read the report from last time. And I think we ran like 24 games and the overall conclusion was that it's quite pessimistic, right? Like something about this is not something that I think they put forward these 4 conditions.
Say the last part again.
They put forward these 4 conditions, which were the recommendations for how to make it more unlikely for China to invade Taiwan, basically. Real puzzle.
4 conditions being?
4 conditions being, I think the first one was that Taiwan needs to be more resistant, they need to stand up for themselves. Second one was that U.S. needs to be able to use the bases in Japan. Third one, I don't remember. Something about that. So, I think overall they kind of just, you mentioned a lot of those elements already. So I just want to ask you, since you mentioned there will be a new run of games, your anticipated results will be given these times, and if so, what will change since the last round?
Well, one point I should make about the simulation that took place, it wasn't really an operational exercise. It was really a Japanese decision-making process exercise. So it's very different. I think if the 2 governments hopefully will be doing tabletop exercises on an operational capabilities perspective, those obviously would have to be classified exercises. We don't want to get into demonstrating to the Chinese exactly what our capabilities are. So this simulation back in July was not, I mean, there are operational issues involved, but it was really more of a policy decision-making process exercise. But I think from the U.S. government, a lot of discussions with Taiwanese about what kind of capabilities Taiwan needs to get. And often countries think, they want the big shiny red things that are very expensive. And the U.S. government now is going through a process of trying to work with Taiwan to be realistic about what do you need that really would be effective in first deterring China, but also stopping China. And a lot of it is it's not always, the big expensive systems. It's first your ammunition supplies, your anti-ship missiles, your anti-air systems, your missile defense systems and things like that. But I think the Taiwanese, in terms of the likelihood of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, is hard to predict. When Admiral Davidson was the U.S. Indo-PACOM commander, he was famous for saying his interpretation is that by 2027, China would have developed its capabilities to the point where Xi Jinping would be confident that he could take Taiwan if he decides to. So that time frame is driving a lot of people that we need to build up our capabilities by 2027. But the concern about, I think it's a realistic possibility that China will try to retake Taiwan. I think it wouldn't start with a land invasion. It would be an intimidation process of cyber attacks and cutting off their communications by cutting the undersea communications cables, trying to bring the financial system down, to just trying to pressure Taiwan. But Xi Jinping has made it very clear many times while he's in power, that's one of his legacies he wants to leave, is that he has reunified Taiwan. So that makes it a very dangerous situation. And the other concern is that as China faces these economic difficulties now, and you've seen the defense minister and the foreign ministers kind of disappear. I'm not a China expert, but it appears there's a lot of internal turmoil taking place in the Chinese government right now. And the economy's got some really serious issues. So they've got more serious demographic issues in the long term than Japan has. So you can see a scenario where Xi Jinping decides, well, okay, I'm going to take the people's attention off of my internal problems and start a war involving Taiwan. I mean, historically, you've seen people do that. So I think the next few years are a very dangerous time. So my advice to the Japanese, you're on the right path. You just need to do it as quickly as possible in terms of building up your capabilities. And the Taiwanese need to be doing the same thing.
Kyle? Yeah. If it heats up in Taiwan and China were to start to escalate, do you see any barriers to a gradual escalation to where it would become much more dramatic? What we've seen in Palestine, Israel, also Russia, Ukraine. Is there any barrier that would prevent that from really getting up to the point where missiles are in the air and it becomes a dramatic attack?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that because it's hard to get into Xi Jinping's mind about what he's thinking. But I guess I would anticipate that it would be kind of a gradual escalation, but it could heat up very quickly, particularly if, as I mentioned, my personal view is that the most realistic situation would be they would be intimidating Taiwan, and cyber attacks on the financial system to try to pressure Taiwan into agreeing to peaceful reunification. But it could escalate very quickly, particularly if the U.S. is trying to resupply or supply Taiwan and putting military assets in the Taiwan Strait to try to deter China. It depends on how the Chinese react to that. And there's pretty strong bipartisan support in the U.S. for helping Taiwan, putting aside Trump if he gets reelected. But within the Republican Party traditionally and the Democratic Party, there's very strong bipartisan support for taking a tough line against China and helping Taiwan. And that doesn't necessarily mean the U.S., sends troops to Taiwan right away. But if we're supplying Taiwan and helping them maintain and build their capabilities, a lot's going to depend on how the Chinese react to that. But in military planning, you kind of have to prepare for the worst case scenario. And Japan's doing the right thing is by building their own capabilities, and hopefully it's enough of a deterrent that I'm hoping that the lesson of Ukraine for China is that the damage to China's economy will be much greater than to Russia, because they're much more of an export-oriented economy, and the financial sanctions would be very damaging to China. And on top of that, we need to make it very clear, we meaning the U.S. and Japan, that the cost of trying to militarily take Taiwan is going to be very, very high. And hopefully that deters them. But that's why it's very important that Japan continue on the path it's on as quickly as possible. The wild card is the U.S. election. And I think the people who want Trump to be elected more than anyone else are Putin and Xi Jinping. I mean, really, I'm an independent. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. But, when you see the situation in the House of Representatives where, the Republicans couldn't even get a speaker elected, and it remains to be seen how long the current speaker is going to last once we get to, the budget crisis coming up on November 17th. So it's a very dangerous signal that historically, there are many times where countries look at the U.S. and think, oh, the U.S. is internally focused and weak, so this is our chance. And it's always a mistake, because I tell people, and I say this seriously, you have to look at American history. We're pretty violent people when you mess with us. If you don't want to attack us and our allies thinking that we don't have the resolve to respond. And people, you say, well, you're just isolationists. Americans just want to eat hot dogs and watch baseball games, and that's true. So when you make us fight, it's like there's no limit. We go all in really quickly. And we're still a very strong economy and a very powerful military. You just hope the Chinese understand that, but it's a question of do they think we have the resolve to respond, and we have to make that very clear.
Okay, we're going to take group questions. So we're going to take all the last questions, like 1 or 2 sentences, and then we'll have a conclusion, because we do have at one point to give up this. So just have it very quick.
What kind of threat do you think the Russian parties put in Vladivostok poses to Japan's security?
And how do you see the attitude of the Bush administration? Actually, he accumulated 43 trillion yen for 5 years. Defense build-up plan. But the budget resource has not been found, actually. So last Friday, Kishida told that he will not make a tax increase next year. So what do you think Russia will see in precise attitude?
Higuro-san and one in the back, I think. Okay? Okay, so Higuro-san and then Emma in the back.
I'm curious.
Very short, very short.
Okay. I'm curious about cover the people. I'm very interested. My question is, well, probably regarding Taiwan, the best scenario for China is peaceful integration. So isolating Taiwan, and Taiwanese people of war, and then kind of surrender to the idea of one country, two systems. It's a bad idea, of course. Still, how can we stop? How can we deter China from isolating?
Emma, and then in the back.
I know you mentioned the production of the Japanese kind of defense products. How would that affect politically within Japan and their government with the kind of the ramping up of defense good, like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Sumitomo, and those companies? How would that affect them?
Emma?
I'm already from Korean Peninsula. Just wondering if you could
Yeah,
And
good
you can
question.
group them, you can
Yeah.
answer the ones you want to answer. and put
Well,
X.
I'll try to answer them all really quickly. The question on the Russian threat in the Far East, I mean, it's a good question because I think after the Cold War, people kind of took their eyes off Russia's threat to China, I mean, to Japan in the Far East. And, you know, my nightmare scenario is the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans and the Chinese cooperating and trying to start things all over. That's why I think we're in a very dangerous situation right now. If the Middle East conflict spreads, I assume the Iranians are talking to the Russians. And this is pure speculation. I don't have any inside information. But I can imagine that, you know, the Russians they're obviously cooperating militarily with the Iranians, a lot of their drones and their systems that they're using in Ukraine. So you look at Iran, I don't think Hamas would do what they're doing without Iranian support in terms of attacking Israel. So you can imagine them sitting here and telling you, okay, this is an opportunity. This will impact the U.S. ability to, and not NATO's ability to continue supplying Ukraine. You know, the next step is what if China gets involved in this in terms of Taiwan, or North Korea against South Korea, and Russia in the Far East involving something is getting involved as well. You know, a few years ago, there was a Russian aircraft and a Chinese aircraft flew over Takashima about the same time. I was on Prime News getting ready to start when that happened, and people saying, well, that was just coincidence. I said, no, that's not coincidental. That had to have been planned. So you know these countries are talking to each other, so it makes it very, very difficult. So in Japanese and U.S. planning, you know, we have to consider the Russian Far East fleet as well. And I don't think they're that capable. I mean, one lesson of Ukraine is the Russians really have not done a very good job of maintaining modern and developing modern capabilities, but they're still a real threat just in terms of numbers. On the Kishida, on the question of postponing the tax increase, there were some articles last week when he said, what he said was, we're going to postpone the debate about the tax increase. And the initial plan was to have that debate in 2024. And he said, well, they don't need to now because there's one benefit of inflation is government revenues go up. And so they just postponed by a year that debate about whether they need a tax increase. Politically, I think there's very few people in the LDP who really want to do a tax increase. And if they don't need to do it, they probably won't. But I'm not concerned at all that puts the defense buildup at risk. I think the 55% increase over 5 years in the defense budget is on track, and I'm very confident it's going to stay on track. And I don't think how they finance it has never been a driver of whether they do it. I mean, the worst case scenario is that they issue more bonds. And you know, when you're at 235% of GDP and accumulated government debt, the 5-year defense build-up program's not that big of a deal. And it's better the finance ministry wants tax increases to increase revenue to deal with the fiscal situation, but I'm not concerned that postponement of the tax increase debate puts the 5-year plan at risk. I'm very confident it's going to go forward as planned. On how China might think of peacefully reunifying Taiwan, I think that's pretty difficult for the Chinese to do. I agree, they would try to pressure Taiwan in many ways short of any military activity. But if the Chinese think that they can somehow convince the Taiwanese government, the Taiwanese people to peacefully reunify, I think that's very naive thinking on the part of the Chinese, because they're really different countries now. I mean, not technically, but they're very different. And the Taiwanese have become used to democracy. And even the Kuomintang, the Kuomintang, the KMT, there used to be a lot of concerns that they would be more susceptible to peacefully reunifying with Taiwan. But I think that concern's gone away because the old people who came from mainland China are dying off, and the younger people that may be members of the KMT party don't think the same way. They're more accustomed. They've grown up in a free democratic society, and they look at Hong Kong and the idea that you can have this, they don't trust the Chinese now because of the way they're handling Hong Kong. The export industry thing is a difficult issue. You know, I wish Japan would supply Ukraine, and the policy doesn't allow them to do it, but I don't have the sense that there's a lot of talk in the security documents and the budget documents about trying to support defense, Japanese industries' defense exports. I don't see a lot of enthusiasm for that on the part of the Japanese defense industry. I mean, they talk about it, but there's not much movement on it. And I think part of it is because the defense industry for Japanese companies is a very small percentage of their business. Like Mitsubishi, the biggest defense company in Japan is Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. But that's only about 10% of their business. Their focus is on their commercial business. And you saw companies like Komatsu a few years ago just got out of, they used to build a lot of the military vehicles for the self-defense force, and they just got out of the business. And I think, and a lot of people think that's because they didn't want to put their commercial construction industry vehicle business in China at risk. And there's that and domestically, a lot of companies here talk about their reputational risk. So there's not a real push from industry that I'm aware of in Japan to loosen the restriction on lethal exports, because a lot of the companies don't want that reputational risk. And their problem in terms of cost here is really economies of scale. They've always traditionally just sold to the Ministry of Defense, and in terms of the international market, it's a pretty small market. So the economies of scale traditionally have made defense items produced domestically here very, very expensive. If they really want to build a defense export industry, I think they should focus on things more realistic opportunities like parts and components and subsystems, instead of this kind of naive view that where we're going to develop a new 6th generation aircraft and export it. That's pretty hard to do, and there's not much of a market for it because it's competing with the F-35, which is, you know, a tremendously capable, not very, by modern fighter standards, not really very expensive. The cost has been coming down because the market is so big. And that's what's difficult for the Japanese defense industry in export terms to compete with, is just economies of scale. They've got to be, even if they change the policy so they can export easier, they've got to be competitive in terms of cost and performance in order to have a market internationally. And that's the real challenge from my perspective. And the last on, yeah, the U.S. expectations of Japanese and South Korea defense cooperation are pretty high. And there was a lot of behind the scenes discussions with both countries, even in the Moon administration, but things went off track with the Moon administration. They're back on track now with the Yoon administration. And when the U.S., Japan, Korea had the trilateral meeting in Washington, it was very clear. The idea is to try to institutionalize U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral defense cooperation as much as possible in the next 3 years while the Yoon administration is here. So if you go back to a administration like the Moon administration after the next Korean election, it becomes more difficult for them to just turn that off. And I think even though the Yoon's popularity is very low in Korea, just like Kishida here and Biden in the U.S., they're all on the right track. On national security issues, I think they're all three doing a very good job. I mean, they've been very effective. I mean, Kishida should get a lot more credit than he does for, you know, the defense budget increase was very impressive. I mean, that's a historic increase, and even Abe wasn't able to do that. Abe made a lot of policy changes, but the average increase in the budget was only 1.8% a year. And this year's defense budget compared to last year's defense budget is 27% increase. Next year's is going to be about a 17% increase, and they'll keep that pace. So overall, over 5 years, it's a 55% increase over the previous 5 years. So I think Kishida's been very effective, but in terms of the U.S., Japan, Korea, or Japan and Japan-Korea military cooperation, it's all part of this network concept that the U.S. is trying to do with all of our allies, because you get the force multiplying. It's much more efficient and effective if we work together and we're networked and training together. We always talked about interoperability for a long time, but we're moving beyond interoperability to being networked. And obviously, we have to deal with information security issues and things like that. They're very difficult, but that's the momentum. That's the direction we're heading. So I think in the next 3 years, you're already seeing a lot more, training together. A couple of days ago, there were press reports about U.S. F-35s and Japan F-35s escorting U.S. B-52s. That's a big, in Japan and Korea relationship, that's a big deal. That's a real sign of progress. I think we're going to see more of that kind of cooperation in the next 2 or 3 years, moving very quickly. Because the idea of having to be networked to deter the Chinese also applies to deterring North Korea. And that North Korea is a bad actor and very dangerous.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
We're sorry to force you to speak with
No, I'm happy to.
with only water. So thank you
right.
very much. I'm very happy you reached out to us, and I hope you'll come back to TUJ.
Right, yeah, I'd be happy to.
And so thanks again. Thank you to everyone.
Yeah, sorry.